so I do talk about religiosity and happiness in my forthcoming book, and you and many other folks who are very pro-religion will be happy to know that the research shows, and I know that you probably know this, that there is a moderate correlation between religiosity and happiness, meaning that on average, people who are more religious tend to manifest higher happiness scores. But we can discuss why that is. Now, I argue that that doesn't mean, though, that if you're not religious, you can't find your way to mount happiness. And I can couch it in a divine language. So you and I are right now engaging in an intoxicating conversation that is truly divine, right? Friendships are divine, as Aristotle said, and as I describe in my book. The love that you have for your children and your wife is a form of, divine love. Having purpose and meaning in your chosen profession, I talk about that in the book. I basically argue that the two most important decisions that either make you happy or incredibly miserable is choosing the right spouse and choosing the right profession. If you make those two choices correctly, you're well on your way to being a happy
That was
person.
Freud's observation, right? Work and love. That was his prescription for a meaningful existence.
Exactly. Yeah. And look, and he said it 100 years ago, and I've said it today, precisely because they are universal truths, to our earlier point. One of the things that I did in this book is really delve into the ancient Greeks, Epictetus and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And here I want to point to a quip that my fellow Lebanese friend Nassim Taleb once told me, which turns out to be hauntingly true. He once was teasing me that he said, I don't know what you study in psychology, Gad, because everything that there is to know about human nature, the ancient Greeks have already said. And now he was quipping me, he was teasing me. But as I started delving into that literature, I said, I think Nassim might be right, because I would get some insight, for example, about the link between cognitive behavior therapy and some other mechanism of happiness and so on. And then I find out that Epictetus had made that exact point over 2,000 years ago. So I think that there are these universal truths that exist, whether it is in how we seek happiness or in any other domain of human import, that are universal precisely because they are an indelible part of our human nature. I mean, that's why I love evolutionary psychology so much, because it is very difficult to have powerful explanations of human behavior void of an evolutionary understanding of our species. And so it always amazes me that people exhibit an animus to evolutionary psychology. What else could it be? Like, where did your brain come from if you take it outside of the purview of evolutionary theory? Absolutely. So one of the things that I talk about in the book that speaks to your very kind introduction at the start, where you talked about me having a sense of humor, I have a whole chapter on, I call it life as a playground. And I basically argue that even the most serious pursuits, for example, the pursuit of science, is a form of play. It's the highest form of play, right? Because in the same way that you try to solve a 1,000-piece puzzle by putting the pieces together, well, what is science? It's drawing links between a whole bunch of variables that heretofore you didn't know were linked together. So the whole endeavor of science is a form of orgiastic higher order play, right?
Yeah.
And so
if it's done right.
If it's done right. And so that's, and by the way, one of the reasons why, I have the sense of humor that I have is because I think it's a very, very powerful way to communicate very serious things. Some people will say, oh, but aren't you abasing yourself as a serious professor by donning that pink wig or by self-flagellating because you're mocking that you're friends with Jordan Peterson? No, because mockery is actually a astronomically powerful way to demonstrate certain forms of lunacy, right? That's why dictators will usually try to eradicate the satirists first. They don't go after the guys with the big muscles. They go after the guys with the sharp tongues and the stinging pen, because those are the ones that are the biggest threat. And so
Gad, you might be interested in this. So I spent a lot of time studying Jaak Panksepp's work on play, and he detailed out the neurophysiology of play to a greater degree than any other scientist that I know. And Panksepp conceptualized play really, I would say, as the state of highest possible neural integration. Because play only emerges when all competing motivating and emotional systems have been satiated and put aside. So if you're able to enter into a state of play, that's actually an indication that you've mastered the domain in which you're exploring so thoroughly that no other competing motivations whatsoever can emerge to disrupt that. And laughter eradicates muscular tension. When I used to work out with my friends, we used to make jokes when people were bench pressing, and as soon as they laughed, they couldn't hold the weight anymore, which was a good part of the joke. But I've spent a lot of time in my last tour laying out the idea to my audiences that the antithesis of tyranny is play. Like if you had to, tyranny is a spirit of sorts, right? It's a malevolent spirit. And you might say, well, what the hell's the opposite of that? And I don't think it's joy. And I don't think it's like the absence of fear or pain. I think it's literally play. And so I think you're dead on in that, in the allying of the spirit of play with the highest form of happiness. It's really something to aim for.
You're exactly right. And actually, so to link play with our earlier discussion about choosing the right spouse. So as you know, Jordan, one of the fundamental rules, universal rules for a happy marriage is the birds of a feather flock together maxim. So there are sort of two competing ideas: opposites attract versus birds of a feather flock together. Now, if you're interested in a short-term sexual dalliance, then opposites attracts might work perfectly well. Yeah, I may be introvert, you're extrovert. You may bring me out of my, sexual shyness, but that's for a short-term, dalliance. But for long-term relationships, it is birds of a feather flock together, at least on things like life goals, values, belief systems. It's not at all opposites attract. Now, that principle of birds of a feather flock together applies specifically to playfulness. And there's very, very interesting research, which if you're not familiar with, I'd be happy to send you some links, that looks at how people who assort on their adult playfulness scores tend to have happier marriages. And I give several
I'd like to
examples.
see that. Yeah, I'd like to see that.
I'll be happy to send you that.
Okay.
And so, for example, one of the things that makes, I know you've met my wife a few times, and you know that we have a very strong relationship. We've been together for 23 years. Is that we're constantly in play mode, right? She can rib on me, and so for example, I'll walk into the room, I'll engage in some kind of faux grandiosity, showing off my muscles, and then she'll say something like, "Oh, we might need to fortify the base of this house because I don't think your ego fits in this house anymore," right? So that's a very fun, right? And we're constantly engaging in this kind of play. We're very, very good friends with each other. Now, of course, you can't always predict a priori when you're choosing to marry someone, whether you score perfectly compatibly on all of these things. But trying to find someone who shares your life mindsets is certainly a prescription for leading a happy marriage. And I'm willing
so that
to
you
bet
can play together. Maybe that's why Eve was made out of Adam's rib.
Perhaps. There you go. Bringing in the religious narrative. Wonderful.